All right, this is Libertarian Overwatch doing our new series here. We're kind of breaking down some of the color revolutions, taking it article by article. We're looking specifically right now at Justin Raimondo's work from antiwar.com, and we have a fun one in store for today. So let's bring here some of the articles that we will be kind of discussing today. I have two in particular. They come within 2 days of each other. So we have the Ukraine template and we have the Yushchenko poison plot fraud. So essentially, if you're unfamiliar with the story, it was in the lead up to the 2004 elections in Ukraine. And one of the contenders in it, Viktor Yushchenko, was allegedly poisoned during this time. And so this article here kind of gives just a little bit of background here. And so some of the parts that I think are important from here is just some of the questions that are being asked. So the first one being, if this was really the KGB, then what's happened to their legendary ruthless efficiency, perhaps the only efficient institution in Soviet society. So in regards to this, the one thing I do want to note here is that if Yushchenko at the time was to die, to pass away as a result of the poisoning, I think you automatically make him a martyr. You know, if you look at any of these kind of deaths in these situations, you know, whether it's in Lebanon and things like that, you know, that person, whoever does end up passing, becomes a martyr at that time. So I think that kind of answers that question, kind of start off here. Now, I do think stuff like this is important where we talk about some of the science behind it. We'll get to that a little bit more later, where we do have some in-depth kind of peer-reviewed studies and things like that. That definitely gives us a little bit better of a story as to what's going on behind that and everything like that. So as we continue to go on here, this one I would say more so kind of talks about kind of the background of Yushchenko himself and things like that. The next one is definitely when we're getting into some the more interesting kind of claims and things like that I think we can kind of debunk a little bit and talk about. So and I do think this part is very important, just talking about Ron Paul, but you know, because it's Ron Paul and he's awesome. So as we go along here, and as I mentioned in my Bulldozer article where we talked about, is it all an NED, a CIA, Soros conspiracy? I do think it's important to mention things like here where we start to talk about the open society networks and things like that. So that you can see in just a few short years, kind of the perception that Justin has regarding some of these revolutions has changed. But this is kind of just the background. Now, here's where we start to get to the meat and potatoes, as it were, of the whole argument and things like that. And so I think this part is very important. And I think there are a few groups of people who either A, don't know about the story in general, or B, people who know generally the story they've been told, or C, people who have heard this side of the story about this Lothar Wick character and things like that, which I think is very important to just discuss and kind of figure out what was the meaning behind all of it, essentially. So as we're looking here, we have Justin being a little skeptical of what is being the initial narrative at the time, which is understandable. But we talked about how Dr. Michael Zimfer of the clinic, I'm not going to pronounce that, in Vienna said that he now considers it a case closed, and that dioxin as a tool that doesn't make a lot of sense. The victim would take far too long to die, and besides that, not a single case of death by dioxin poisoning has ever been recorded. As I mentioned earlier, I think that if you are using something so significant, it does make him a martyr, and you've really lost the cause at that point, obviously. So as we go here, I want to go down here. Yes, here we go. So we have the chief medical doctor at the clinic who was supervised and had firsthand knowledge of Yushchenko's case was Dr. Lothar Wick. And it says, I put in past tense because he resigned, which is true. He did resign from the clinic after this. It says, it seems that his skeptical remarks about it made it so that essentially he got fired from it. As we have here, we have kind of talking about some local papers at the time and things like that. Thereafter, Yushchenko's people made clear to Wick that he should not say anything more concerning the affair, since otherwise, as Wick puts it, one will resort to other means against me in the hospital. Dr. Wick is also supposed to have received death threats at the time. Then we have some more talking about from a French newspaper and talking about a strange security force with Slavic accents, and that the cops were there to get Yushchenko's medical files and things like that. So, I mean, as you can see, there is plenty of room for speculation, especially with how odd some of the odds and ends happening around here are at the time. And so let's keep on going down here. And really, I think one of the more interesting things about all this is that a lot of this information you have to really kind of dig for. It's not as readily available as you would imagine it to be. And I think that's also what leads to some of the speculation that we're seeing in this case. So as we go along here, he says, talking about the different kind of doctors that were involved and things like that. And as we go along down here, so essentially what they're talking about, Justin in this article is saying that it's essentially a lie and things like that. And I want to see if it's mentioned in here. It is not mentioned in here. But in one of his articles, I know that he talks about how there was a biopsy done and that he had refused to do the biopsy, and that kind of leading to the way saying like this is all very fishy. Now, regarding the biopsy, you must remember that at this time, he was in the middle of running for presidency of Ukraine. And so he was literally trying to save face. When you do a biopsy, there is a chance that you get scarring and things like that. And so they were trying to get the biopsy done from the different things that they were seeing on his face and things like that. So you can kind of understand, think about how important your presentation is for a presidential election and things like that. The perception of Joe Biden was, oh, he's your fun grandpa. With Donald Trump, oh, he's the charismatic guy. Obama, wow, he's really cool. He's, he plays basketball. He does all these cool things, George Bush, he's your lovable country guy, Bill Clinton is a charmer, and things like that. No matter what you think about, those presidents, that's just kind of the perception and things like that, right? So saving face is quite literally, I think, what Yushchenko was doing in this case. But now what I want to dive into is kind of what's going on with the Lothar Wick situation, what's going on with all these different characters that are involved here. So let's go to our next article here. And this part I think is interesting because it kind of just more so adds to the confusion. But essentially, the whole story here about Yushchenko getting poisoned, it was this meeting that they had with the SBU around the time of the elections. And so they're trying to figure out like who ended up doing this alleged poisoning and things like that. And it was mentioned that his wife kissed him and that she could kind of taste it. And there are some Guardian articles talking about like all the side effects that were being had as a result of the poisoning. And so I think this one's interesting to note because it's just Yushchenko starts to point the finger at Zavania, who's actually, I think this is an important part to point out too, is that it's the godfather of one of Yushchenko's children. But I think the reason that we're seeing this in this case is that Zavania is saying, I don't know, he's kind of questioning the poisoning narrative. Now, this comes from 2008, which I think is pretty significant as well. So still not having a full, clear case as to who was behind the poisoning. And so I think as soon as Zavania says, I don't know if it's poisoning, Yushchenko goes, it's you did it. Which I feel like is just human nature to, if one of your friends were to say something like that, be like, there's something a little bit fishy about that. I'm going to throw the blame back at you, So there's that article. That's from the New York Times. And now I want to go to this article from UPI here because this is very significant. So it says, report, the French PR firm linked to poisoning. So this is where the story really kind of starts to break apart a little bit. So as we go down here, and then here are some of the levels, I will say across the different timelines and things like that, that level of how deadly the poisoning was and things like that, that shifts quite a bit. We see 6,000, we see 5,000. It changes no matter which kind of context you're looking at for it. But I think some important points here that I want to point out is, especially once we get here, soon after Yushchenko first claimed that he'd been poisoned, President Leonid Kuchma's son-in-law engaged a French public relations team to initiate a media campaign centered on a Vienna clinic calculated to disparage the poisoning accusations, the newspaper said. And so this is the company that is behind kind of that PR campaign, which is what sent Dr. Lothar Wick. And if you go over here, I want to point out to this because this is what the company is now called. It's now called Havas Media Ukraine, which is more than an agency. It's a catalyst for change and a creator of narratives that not only captivate, but inspire lasting transformations. And you can see down here some of the other stuff they've been doing recently and things like that. So it was founded in 2007. This was in 2004. So a few years later, this is what the group eventually becomes. So let's go back to our UPI article because I think this is kind of crucial to kind of breaking open the whole story and the allegations from Lothar Wick. So as we go down here, Lothar Wick, the general manager of the Vienna clinic, contradicted Yushchenko's poisoning allegations. And also contacting international media offering evidence that Yushchenko had not been poisoned. So that international media was the Financial Times. So the Financial Times also had an article about this and also pointed to Euro RSG behind it all and things like that. So let's go over here. This is where we start to get a little bit more scientific with it. This is from the 2009. Yep, this is a 2009 study posted in the Lancet, and it kind of goes into the science behind the poisoning of Viktor Yushchenko. And so this is also a very crucial part to note is TCDD. So there are a few things I want to note about this. This poisoning is very specific, this dioxin that's being used. So there's two ways to kind of look at it. Obviously, if we were to take into account that article I just showed you from UPI, the Wick character, his allegations can very clearly be called into question, especially that he was working for a French PR firm to disseminate this information. But if you were to take him for his word, it's also possible that that dioxin was not able to be detected at the time, since we do have this dioxin being TCDD, which is a very specific form of poisoning. And as we can see here, it wasn't until late December that we were able to see that he presented with that TCDD poisoning. And as I said, these numbers really do change quite a bit, but this one gives a little bit more context into it. And so it kind of comes up with the findings. And now this one, like we said, this is in 2009, so this is about 5 years after the fact. And it just kind of dives into it, and it even talks a little bit. I want to say one of the resources they used or references they use is the doctor suing Dr. Lothar Wick. And so as we see here, like I said, it's just very in-depth, very stylized, talking about the blood serum and all these things. And so as you can see here, in late 2004, we were presented with a patient who is severely affected with TCDD poisoning. Without a established specific treatment protocol for such a severe and painful disease, the two possible treatment strategies were continuously to monitor the poison, its form, distribution, and elimination. So as you can see here, we go a little bit more in depth here, and also just talking about the different countries involved. The next source I have to share with us will also go into how many different hospitals and things were involved in this. I think really kind of blowing open this whole Lothar Wick story and kind of burying it a little bit. But as we go along here, yeah, so this is, like I said, this is the science behind it all. Very interesting. And here are some of the doctors that signed off on it. And if we go over here, this is the part that I want to kind of stress here. So this is December 19th, 2004. So right at the end of the year. This is, like I said, when we're starting to get the stories of it being the TCDD. And so we're having it confirmed by labs in the Netherlands and Germany, 3 separate labs. So essentially at this point, we're coming to the conclusion that Lothar Wick is, if we're going with Justin's interpretation of the events, we're saying that Lothar Wick is telling the truth, and that labs from the Netherlands, Germany, all these scientists that signed all these papers, they're all false, that it's all kind of made up, which I don't believe. So, but I do think, as I mentioned before in the Bulldozer Revolution article, the one thing I wanted to point out is that it's a little bit in hindsight. So the Lancet, the full kind of study doesn't come out until 2009. Right in the heat of things in 2004, especially just not even having access to some of this information, the internet is a very different place nowadays in 2026 than it was in 2004. So having some of these alternative resources and things like that helps you to kind of explain the story. It had a very interesting one at that. Now, I do want to hop into this too, because I think this is very interesting. And this is recently, this was 2024. And so this is actually a National Intelligence Council memorandum. And specifically, I want to highlight this part right here, where it says, the first clear case in the Putin era of Moscow directing an assassination abroad occurred in 2004 in Qatar. That's not the one I want to look for. Where is the one? Okay. There we go. I knew it was 2004 somewhere here. Okay. So a key example is former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, who suffered a near-fatal poisoning in 2004. His supporters concluded that Russian intelligence introduced the chemical dioxin into his food when he was a presidential candidate among Ukraine's integration from the West. So I think this is also very interesting because at this point, we don't exactly know who was behind the poisoning. We do have a few different sources kind of coming to different conclusions and things like that. And it's in Mark McKinnon's excellent book where he talks about how on one of the local channels, they're saying that it was Gleb Pavlovsky, the spin doctor, as it were, in Russia. But we can't confirm that. And even Mark, he kind of says, like, I don't know that this is confirmed. They did have like audio that was played on there, but that could very well be fabricated. So, and I just find it interesting that the framing that we have here, where it says his supporters concluded. So not that the U.S. government, not that anyone else concluded, that just his supporters said this is the truth. So a little bit shady there. But essentially, going back to Justin's case and the poisoning, to kind of go to it, I think the biggest things I want to discuss and kind of take away from all of this is that essentially Lothar Wick was reportedly given directions from Euro RSG, which is a company that is trying to disseminate. That's also someone related to Kuchma, who Kuchma obviously wants to, remain in power, remain a part of the government in Ukraine. So someone who is his son-in-law at Euro RSG, they are then disseminating this information and sending Dr. Lothar Wick to the clinic to say that this poisoning was false and fabricated, at which point, if that were true, as I said, the labs in Germany, Netherlands, they would all have to be lying about this. The articles from The Guardian that described just the severe pain he was in was lying about it. I guess he put on makeup to make it look like he was suffering, even though he wasn't. As we discussed, the biopsy, quite literally just trying to save face. So I think this is a very interesting case where in the time we have a very different story. And if I were in Justin's shoes in 2004, I think I would come to the same conclusion, to be honest. When you're hearing some stuff where there's this one guy and they're like, hey, let's not let him talk. Let's take some of these medical files. We're gonna take this for us. I would be a little skeptical too. So I just wanted to come here and kind of discuss Justin's article because once again, it's very interesting. And he's not just, shooting from the hip of just random, this conspiracy. He has the sources, he has the different newspapers. I mean, as you can see here, we have the German newspaper, we have a French daily. So we definitely have our sources. It's just at this point, I don't think that this route is correct. I think that Yushchenko was in fact poisoned. We have the Lancet backing that up. We have all those doctors who signed on saying this is what we saw at the time. It was a specialized dioxin, the TCDD, that we were able to analyze around the end of December. And we have the different reports from the labs in Germany and the Netherlands. I know there are a couple of other ones. I don't have that source right here off the top of my head, but I know in my research, it was more than just those three as well that confirmed this case. We don't know who solved it at this point. And another thing that I think Justin, maybe in this article or another article, kind of points to is that they didn't do like a full investigation into it, and kind of that being, a little weird. But you got to remember, at the time, this is when he is running for the presidency. To derail your campaign with something like that is something that could really just derail everything that's currently going on, So that is the case of Dr. Lothar Wick. That is the case of the Yushchenko poisoning. So in conclusion, I think that he did end up getting poisoned. Justin differed at the time. I would be very interested if, I know Justin unfortunately has passed away since, but I would be interested to know if he, when in the late, early 2010s, if he still kind of stuck to the story of Dr. Lothar Wick and things like that. But anyways, that is the case of the poisoning in Ukraine. I thought I'd share some of those different sources that I have with you to kind of set the story straight as it is. But let me know, do you have a different interpretation? Do you think that Lothar Wick was telling the truth? Do you think that Euro RSG played any role in this? What do you think about the studies that they say about the Yushchenko poisoning and things like that? So please comment here and let me know what you thought about this, and we'll continue to dive into more of Justin's articles.